I should start by saying I don't believe in the supernatural. I believe in data, in logic, in the things that make up the structure of our world. I work in aviation. Or at least I did. After what happened, I don't know if I can set foot in an airport again. It began on a Tuesday. A routine flight, Flight 742, a Boeing 737, scheduled to fly from Newark to Miami. I was on the night shift in the Airport Operations Center, monitoring flights, logging arrivals and departures, the usual. Around 11:30 p.m., we got the signal that Flight 742 had taken off on schedule. No issues, no delays. A standard 2-hour flight. But it never landed. The first sign that something was wrong came when the Miami tower reported no contact with the plane. Radio silence. They pinged it. No response. The transponder, which tracks altitude and position, showed the aircraft still moving, but slightly off course. It was minor, nothing drastic. At first, we thought the pilots had adjusted their route for weather. Then, at 2:19 a.m., the transponder stopped transmitting altogether. No distress signal. No emergency squawk code. Just nothing. A missing aircraft is an emergency of the highest order. The FAA was notified. Search and rescue teams were mobilized. Military radars showed no sign of debris, no crash site, nothing. Just a plane that had lifted off and ceased to exist somewhere over the Atlantic. I spent the next 3 days in a fog of exhaustion, scanning every possible data point, replaying every conversation between air traffic control and the pilots, listening to static-filled silence. Nothing made sense. A commercial airliner doesn't just vanish. And then, on the 4th day, the call came in. Flight 742 had landed. I need to know if you're ready for the next part. Because what I saw when I got to that plane, I still don't understand it. I remember the call like it was yesterday. The Air Traffic Control Center in Miami was buzzing when I picked up. The voice on the other end was sharp, urgent. Flight 742 has arrived. It's on the tarmac. No passengers. No crew. I froze for a moment, my heart skipping. How is that even possible? I thought it was a mistake. But then the reality of it hit me, and I jumped into action. I was on the next flight down, heading straight to Miami. It was around 4 a.m., and I hadn't slept in nearly 72 hours. But there was no room for exhaustion now. There was something wrong, something that defied explanation. When I arrived at the airport, everything was eerily quiet. It felt too early for the usual rush, but there was also an undeniable tension in the air. The hangar where the plane was parked had already been roped off. Security was tight, and there were more officers and airport personnel than I expected. I was escorted to the plane. As I walked down the runway, the sound of my footsteps echoed, far too loud for the stillness around me. My skin prickled with an odd sensation. Something was wrong. There it was, Flight 742, parked like a forgotten relic, bathed in the dim light of the hangar's overheads. The body of the plane was pristine, no scratches, no visible damage, like it had just been polished. It was surreal. Too perfect for something that had been gone for days. But the doors were still locked. No one had boarded to deplane, no baggage had been unloaded. The entire jet was empty, completely and utterly deserted. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I could feel it. The cabin smelled faintly of something sterile, almost like hospital disinfectant. The kind of scent that stings your nose when you're stuck in a place that's been untouched for too long. I made my way down the aisle, my shoes clicking softly on the carpeted floor. The overhead bins were still closed, the seat belts neatly fastened, and there was not a single trace of a passenger. I don't know why I did it, but I opened the cockpit door. The creaking sound of it felt like it was coming from the deepest part of the plane. Inside, the pilot's seat was vacant. So was the co-pilot's. The controls were on, but the autopilot was engaged. The flight logs were still running, and the screen showed the plane had been in the air for 72 hours. But no one was there to have operated it. I stepped closer to the dashboard, my eyes scanning the instruments, but my mind was racing in 1,000 directions. How was this possible? The systems were intact, nothing seemed malfunctioning. There was no sign of struggle. No indication that anything had gone wrong in the cockpit. The radio was still transmitting, but when I turned it on, there was only static. As I reached for the intercom, I heard something, footsteps. I whipped around, expecting someone to be standing there, but the cabin was still empty. No one had followed me in. My pulse hammered in my chest. I was alone. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. A small, folded piece of paper was lying on the co-pilot's seat. It was so out of place that I felt a chill run down my spine. It had clearly been placed there. I walked over and picked it up, unfolding it with trembling hands. There were no words, just a simple, hastily drawn diagram of the plane's interior layout. But in the middle of the diagram, there was something odd, a dark X over the seat nearest to the emergency exit. The ink was smudged in places, as if someone had drawn it in a hurry. And at the very bottom of the page, in the smallest writing, was a note. "They're still here." I felt the blood drain from my face. The atmosphere in the cockpit suddenly felt suffocating. The air seemed thicker, colder. I had to leave. But before I could turn around, I heard it again, footsteps. And this time, they were closer. I didn't wait to see who was there. I bolted out of the cockpit, down the aisle, and out of the plane as fast as I could. The sound of my footsteps was drowned out by a low, unexplainable hum that seemed to be coming from inside the plane. By the time I reached the tarmac, I was nearly out of breath. I turned around, eyes darting to the aircraft. The dark hum, it was still there, pulsating from within, like the sound of something alive. I didn't understand what I had just witnessed. I still don't. But the more I think about it, the more I can't shake the feeling that something never left that plane. And maybe, just maybe, it never will. I stood on the tarmac, staring at the plane, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My ears were still ringing with the low hum I'd heard inside. It hadn't stopped. That was the worst part. Even out here, in the open air of the hangar, I could still feel it, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in my chest. Like the distant thrum of an idling engine, except the plane wasn't on. Nothing should have been running. I forced myself to focus. My hands were still gripping the note, the strange, hastily drawn diagram with the X over the emergency exit seat. And those 3 words written in cramped, uneven handwriting. "They're still here." Who had left it? My mind was cycling through possibilities, trying to stay rational. Maybe one of the pilots had scribbled it before something went wrong. Maybe it was a warning. Or maybe it was something worse, a message left after the plane had landed. I needed answers. But I also needed someone to believe me. I turned and made my way back toward the hangar's entrance. A small group of officials had gathered outside, FAA investigators, airport security, a couple of airline reps. Their expressions ranged from disbelief to outright unease. One of them, a man named Carson, an FAA investigator I'd met before, was the first to approach me. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked toward the plane behind me, like he didn't want to look at it for too long. I hesitated. I wanted to tell him about the footsteps, the note, the hum, but what if he thought I was losing it? Instead, I took a slow breath. "There's something wrong with that plane," I said. Carson gave a tired nod, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Yeah," he muttered. "No kidding." I looked at him. "You mean besides the fact that it vanished for 3 days and came back empty?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for me to follow him. We walked a short distance to a small security office inside the hangar. The fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead as Carson shut the door behind us. He reached into a folder on the desk and pulled out a sheet of paper, sliding it toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then the realization hit me like a hammer. It was the flight log. The final data transmission from Flight 742 before it vanished. The last recorded altitude, speed coordinates. And the last audio transmission. The transcript was brief, only a few lines of dialogue between the pilot and air traffic control just before the plane went silent. I read through it quickly. The first few exchanges were routine. Normal communication. Then, 1:57 a.m., ATC. Flight 742, you're drifting slightly north of your flight path. Confirming course correction? 1:57 a.m., Captain Reynolds, pilot. Yeah, slight deviation for weather. Nothing major. 1:58 a.m., ATC. Copy that. Confirm altitude at 35,000 feet? 1:58 a.m., Reynolds. Stand by. Pause. That's strange. Instruments are showing indistinct audio interference. 1:59 a.m., ATC. Say again, 742? 1:59 a.m., Reynolds, static. We have, someone's moving in the audio distortion, transmission ends. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I looked at Carson. What is this? He sighed, rubbing his temples. That's the last thing we heard before Flight 742 disappeared. I stared at the paper, rereading the last few lines. Someone's moving in the what? The black box recording is being analyzed. Carson continued. But the raw audio is corrupted. Almost like something interfered with it. My mouth was dry. Interfered how? He hesitated. Like it was scrambled. There's noise in the background, low frequency, almost like a hum. I stiffened. A hum? Carson raised an eyebrow. Yeah. I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell him I'd heard it too. That it was still coming from the plane, even now. That it was getting stronger. But before I could say anything, a sharp clatter echoed from the hangar outside. Both of us turned toward the door. Another sound followed, metal scraping against metal. A deep, unnatural groan from the direction of the aircraft. Carson was already moving, yanking open the door. I followed, my pulse hammering. Out in the hangar, the security officers were frozen, staring at the plane. One of them had a hand on his radio, his face pale. I followed their gaze. The emergency exit door was open. The very same door marked with the X on the diagram I found. I felt my stomach drop. That door had been locked when I left the plane. It had been sealed since the aircraft landed. Carson muttered a curse under his breath. He motioned for security to move in. One of the officers, a younger guy with tense shoulders, took a cautious step forward, shining his flashlight toward the open door. The hum was louder now. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until the officer reached the entrance. He hesitated, then slowly peered inside. Silence. And then, he staggered backward, pale as a sheet. His flashlight clattered to the floor. Carson rushed to him. What is it? What did you see? The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. Just a strangled breath. Carson turned to me. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was tight. We need to search the plane. I knew he was right. But every nerve in my body screamed not to go back in there. Because whatever had been on Flight 742 before it vanished, it wasn't finished yet. I didn't want to go back inside that plane. But I also knew there was no choice. Whatever was happening, whatever this was, it wasn't over. Carson signaled the security team forward. A few of them hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. No one wanted to be the first to step inside. Not after the way the young officer had stumbled back like he'd seen something he couldn't comprehend. Carson wasn't the kind of guy who let fear get in the way of his job. Without another word, he grabbed a flashlight and climbed the mobile stairs to the open emergency exit. I followed, my stomach twisting into knots. The air felt different as soon as I stepped onto the threshold. Heavier. Charged. The hum was louder inside. Not deafening, not overwhelming, but present. Alive. I swept my flashlight across the cabin. It still looked the same as before. Rows of neatly fastened seatbelts, overhead bins closed, no sign of struggle. No sign of anyone. Except now, The emergency exit door was wide open. And on the floor, directly beneath the marked seat from the diagram, something was there. A shoe. I stopped cold. It was small. A woman's, maybe? A flat. Beige. It looked completely ordinary, except for the fact that it shouldn't be here. Carson stepped beside me, following my gaze. He crouched down, reaching for it, but I grabbed his wrist. "Don't," I said before I even knew why. He gave me a sharp look. "Why?" I had no answer. No logical reason. Just a deep, primal certainty that he shouldn't touch it. That it belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to be here anymore. Carson exhaled sharply, but he didn't argue. He stood, shining his flashlight around the cabin again. The other security officers had started filtering in behind us, checking the aisles, moving cautiously. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple. I didn't want to say it, but I had to. "Someone was sitting here," I murmured, pointing to the marked seat. Carson glanced at me. "What?" I crouched, my hands hovering just above the seat's fabric. There was no dust, no indication that this plane had been missing for days. But there was something subtle. The seat was warmer than the others. Not hot. Not enough for someone to have just stood up. But enough that it felt used. Carson was about to say something when the static crackled through the cabin speakers. The entire plane seemed to shudder with the sound. A voice, distorted, garbled, hissed through the intercom system. It lasted only a second, a fragmented sound that didn't form any words, and then, silence. The lights flickered. The hum deepened. One of the security officers muttered something under his breath, shifting nervously. Another reached for his radio. "Control, we're experiencing electrical interference in the aircraft," he said. His voice was strained. "Possible." And then the oxygen masks dropped. Every single one. All at once. A gasp ran through the group as the yellow masks dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently in the stale air. The motion was eerily synchronized, like unseen hands had yanked them down in unison. I took a step back, my skin cold. Oxygen masks don't just deploy. Not unless there's a cabin depressurization. Or something triggers them manually. My heart was pounding now. I turned to Carson, but before I could say anything. Footsteps. Not ours. Coming from the cockpit. Slow. Deliberate. Like someone, or something, was moving inside. Carson reacted first. He snapped his flashlight up, his body tense. One of the security officers shouted, "Who's there?" No answer. Then the cockpit door clicked. Not a bang. Not a slam. Just a soft, deliberate click, as if whoever was inside had just locked us out. A deep, visceral dread settled in my chest. Carson turned to me, his face unreadable. But I could see it in his eyes. He'd finally realized it, too. We weren't alone. I stood frozen, my breath locked in my throat. The sound of that soft, deliberate click echoed in my mind, louder than it should have been. Something had locked the cockpit door. Something that shouldn't be here. The security officer who had shouted a moment ago moved forward, his posture stiff. He reached for the door handle, testing it. It didn't budge. "Cockpit secured," he muttered, turning back toward Carson. "You want me to force it?" Carson hesitated. Breaking into a cockpit wasn't something you did lightly, even in a grounded plane under investigation. But the circumstances here weren't normal. Not even close. Before he could answer, the hum, that strange, low vibration I had felt since stepping onto the plane, deepened. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't mechanical. It was something else. Something wrong. And then, from the other side of the locked cockpit door, we heard it. Breathing. I swear to God, I felt every hair on my arms stand up. It was faint, but it was there, slow, measured inhales, like someone was standing just inches from the door, waiting. Listening. "Who's in there?" Carson barked. His voice was sharp, commanding. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then knocking. 4 slow, heavy knocks. Even the security officers, who had probably seen just about everything in their line of work, shifted uncomfortably. One of them pulled his gun, exchanging a glance with Carson. "Force it," Carson said. His voice was tight. The officer nodded. He braced himself, then slammed his shoulder into the door. The moment he made contact, the cabin lights went out. Everything plunged into absolute darkness. And then, the intercom crackled to life again. The voice that came through was distorted, broken. Not quite human. At first, it was just static. Then, "Where did they go?" I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. It was a question. Directed at us. I wanted to move. To turn. To run. But I couldn't. None of us could. The hum grew louder. The pressure in the cabin felt off, like we were suddenly at altitude, like the air was thinner. My ears popped. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the lights flickered back on. And the cockpit door was wide open. The officer who had slammed into it was still standing there, frozen mid-motion. But the resistance was gone. The door had unlocked itself. Carson's flashlight swept inside. The cockpit was empty. Both pilot seats sat undisturbed, the instrument panels softly glowing, flight logs still active. There was no one there. But there was something else. Something that hadn't been there before. A recording device. A small, handheld voice recorder sat neatly placed on the captain's chair. No one touched it at first. No one wanted to. Carson swallowed hard, then reached for it. His hands were steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He pressed play. At first, just static. Then a voice. A man's voice. Shaky. Panicked. Desperate. I recognized it immediately. It was Captain Reynolds. "This is Flight 742, something's wrong, There's someone walking in the cabin. I can hear them. Passengers are asleep but I see movement. Distortion. The hum begins. Checked with my first officer, says he hears it too. Doors are locked. We should be alone. Not passengers. I saw one. Just for a second. Wrong. Too tall. The recording cuts out sharply. Then, after a few seconds of silence. Where did they go? And then, nothing. The recorder clicked off. None of us spoke. The weight of what we had just heard pressed down on the entire cabin like a living thing. I turned slowly toward the emergency exit. The shoe was still there. And I knew, with a deep, suffocating certainty, that whoever it belonged to had never left the plane. We just couldn't see them. Nobody moved. The weight of that last recording, the final words of Captain Reynolds, hung in the air like a thick fog. Where did they go? Carson clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the recorder. One of the security officers looked like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it. The captain saw something in the cabin before the plane disappeared. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And now, the plane had come back, but the people hadn't. Why? I turned toward the open emergency exit again, my mind racing. The shoe was still there, untouched. It felt deliberate. A marker. A breadcrumb. A reminder. I forced myself to speak. What if they never actually left the plane? Carson frowned. What? I hesitated. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't shake it. What if the passengers and crew are still here? I whispered. We just can't see them. Nobody responded. Because what the hell do you say to that? Carson exhaled sharply. All right. Enough. We need answers, not ghost stories. He turned to one of the officers. Get forensics in here. I want a full sweep, prints, DNA, anything. We'll pull the black box data, see if we can clean up the audio. The officer nodded and grabbed his radio. As he stepped away, I noticed something strange. His breath. It was visible. A soft, white mist curling from his mouth in the dim cabin light. I looked at Carson. He saw it too. The temperature had dropped. I rubbed my arms. It wasn't just cold. It was wrong. A creeping, invasive chill, like the air itself had turned against us. Then, the cabin lights flickered again. Not a full blackout this time. Just a brief, stuttering flicker. Like a dying signal. A whisper of movement caught my eye. The overhead luggage bins. One of them had opened. Not fast. Not violently. Just open. The security officer standing nearest to it flinched. He swallowed and took a hesitant step forward, lifting his flashlight. Inside the bin. Nothing. Just an empty compartment. But the moment he reached for it, the bin next to it snapped open. And then the next. And the next. One by one, every overhead compartment on the plane unlatched and creaked open, all the way down the length of the cabin. Like invisible hands had moved through, flipping them open in perfect, methodical sequence. The officer backed up fast, nearly tripping over himself. What the hell? His radio screeched with static. Then, through the crackling interference, a voice. Low. Warped. Distant. Help us! The words sent a bolt of pure, primal terror through me. Because it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from all around us. Soft. Fragmented. As if the cabin itself was whispering. Help us! I felt the blood drain from my face. The voices weren't just random. They were pleading. Carson moved fast. Out. Now. No one argued. The second our feet hit the tarmac, Carson slammed the exit door shut behind us. The hum from inside the plane, deep, vibrating, alive, didn't stop. In fact, I swear it got louder. Like it knew we had tried to leave. Carson turned to one of the security officers. No one goes back in. Not until we figure out what's happening. The officer nodded quickly. He was pale, sweating despite the cold. I looked back at the plane. It just sat there, motionless on the tarmac, but I could feel something watching us from inside. Carson ran a hand over his face, muttering a curse. None of this makes sense. I didn't respond. Because deep down, I had a horrible, sickening feeling that I did understand. The plane wasn't empty. The passengers were still there. Trapped. And something we couldn't see, was keeping them that way. We stood on the tarmac, staring at the silent plane like it was something alive. No one spoke. No one even moved. Even the security officers, trained men who had probably dealt with every kind of emergency imaginable, looked shaken. One of them was gripping his radio so tightly I thought it might snap in his hands. The hum from the plane hadn't stopped. It had become a constant, underlying vibration in the air. A sound that didn't just fill the space, it filled us. Carson finally turned to me. We need to check the black box. I nodded, though every nerve in my body screamed against it. The black box, the flight data recorder, was our only chance of understanding what had happened on Flight 742 before it vanished. And maybe, just maybe, it would tell us why it came back. The hangar. We moved quickly, relocating to a secured hangar where the plane's black box was already being analyzed. A few FAA technicians were gathered around a monitor, their faces tight with focus. One of them, a woman named Ortiz, looked up as we entered. She was pale. Carson didn't waste time. Tell me you got something. Ortiz hesitated. Then she clicked a few keys, bringing up an audio waveform on the screen. The data is mostly intact, she said carefully. We were able to recover the last few minutes before the plane vanished. I stepped closer. And? Ortiz pressed play. At first, just normal flight noise. The low chatter of the pilots, the occasional ping of an announcement. Then static. Followed by Captain Reynolds' voice, shaky, barely above a whisper. Cabin pressure normal, we're still in control. A few seconds of silence. Then, something new. A different voice. A passenger. A woman, speaking in a panicked whisper. She wasn't using the intercom. Her voice was faint, like she was talking to someone sitting next to her. "Do you see them?" Another whisper. A man's voice. "Don't look. Don't let them know you can see." I felt my stomach drop. Then came the knocking. Slow. Rhythmic. The same pattern we had heard from the locked cockpit door. 4 slow, heavy knocks. Ortiz fast-forwarded. The recording became garbled, distorted. But something new emerged. Something that shouldn't have been there. A third voice. Not the pilots. Not the passengers. Something low. Something wrong. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in sounds. Shifting, unnatural noises that almost formed syllables. Almost formed meaning, but not quite. Whatever it was in the cabin. And then, over it all, Captain Reynolds, barely audible, breathing heavily into the intercom. "They're not supposed to be here, they're not." The hum deepened. The audio cut out. The recording ended. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Ortiz turned back to us, her hands visibly shaking. "That's where the data stops," she said. "That's the moment the plane disappeared." I felt dizzy. Passengers whispering about things they weren't supposed to see. Knocking sounds. A voice that wasn't human. Carson ran a hand over his face. "This is insane." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "But it's real." A tense silence filled the room. And then, the hangar lights flickered. The hum, the one from inside the plane, was here now. Rising. Vibrating through the metal walls of the hangar. And then, from the far end of the room, a knock. 4 slow, deliberate knocks. Not from the plane. From the inside of the hangar. The sound sent a shockwave through me. Carson turned sharply, his eyes wide. The security officers moved fast, drawing weapons, flashlights slicing through the dim space. "Who's there?" one of them called out. No response. Another knock. Closer this time. Ortiz gasped, her fingers flying over the keyboard, scrambling to rewind the black box recording. And then, we heard it. Not over the speakers. Not from the hangar. But from behind us. A whisper. "Where did they go?" I turned just in time to see movement, a flicker of something tall, too tall, standing in the shadows between the equipment racks. Not moving toward us. Just standing there. Watching. And then, as fast as it had appeared, it was gone. But the hum remained. And the knocks didn't stop. The thing in the shadows was gone. But the hum remained. It vibrated through the metal walls of the hangar, through the floor beneath our feet, through the air itself. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence. A warning. Carson swore under his breath, stepping back, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. One of the security officers had already drawn his weapon, his flashlight sweeping across the dimly lit corners of the hangar. Ortiz was still frozen at the terminal, her breathing fast and shallow. I couldn't move. I couldn't shake the image of that thing I had just seen, tall, motionless, just watching. Then, the knocking started again. 4 slow, methodical knocks. This time, they weren't coming from one place. They were everywhere. The metal walls of the hangar. The support beams. The floor beneath us. The equipment racks. Like something was all around us, surrounding us, pressing closer. Ortiz let out a shaky breath. We need to get out of here." Carson nodded. "Now." He motioned to the security officers, and we started moving. Fast. The second we reached the exit, I felt a sudden shift in the air. A drop in pressure, like the atmosphere had changed. Ortiz reached for the door handle. And every single computer screen in the hangar flickered to life. The black box recording was playing again. But we hadn't pressed play. The distorted voice of Captain Reynolds crackled through the speakers. "They're not supposed to be here." The screen flashed static. The audio warped. Then new words. Not from the pilots. Not from the passengers. From something else. "Let them in." The door slammed shut. Ortiz screamed. Carson grabbed the handle, yanking hard. It wouldn't budge. The hum was deafening now. The metal walls groaned, like the hangar itself was about to cave in. I spun around, heart hammering. And then, I saw them. All at once. Passengers. Scattered through the hangar. Some standing between the equipment racks. Some lined up near the walls. Some standing just inches behind us. Men. Women. Children. Silent. Unmoving. Eyes wide, mouths slightly open, as if frozen in the last moment before they vanished. Their faces were wrong. Their skin too pale, too smooth like wax. Their eyes hollow. Empty. Like they weren't really there. A woman stood closest to me, her hands limp at her sides, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I recognized her. The shoe. The one in the emergency exit. It was hers. Then, all at once, they moved. Not like people. Like puppets being yanked forward by invisible strings. Their mouths opened in perfect unison. And they spoke together. Not their own voices. A single voice. Deep. Warped. Not human. Where did they go? The lights burst. Everything went black. Everything went black. For a second, maybe longer, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sense of direction. Just that unbearable, suffocating hum, vibrating in my bones. Then a flicker. The emergency lights kicked on, casting the hangar in a deep red glow. The passengers were gone. Vanished. But the feeling of them lingered, like the air itself still remembered they had been there. Ortiz was sobbing softly, clutching the edge of the desk like she might collapse. Carson was breathing hard, his fingers still curled around the gun at his side. Nobody spoke. Because what the hell were we supposed to say? One of the security officers, Dawson, moved first. He fumbled for his flashlight, his face pale as death. What the fuck just happened? No one answered. Because none of us knew. I forced myself to swallow the fear clawing up my throat. The door? I rasped. We need to get out. Carson moved fast, yanking at the handle again. This time, it gave way. The door swung open. And I swear, just for a fraction of a second, I saw something standing on the other side. Not a person. Something tall. Something thin. Something with too many joints. Then it was gone. Like it had never been there at all. We ran. Not walked. Ran. Bursting out of the hangar, into the open air of the tarmac. The cold night hit me like a slap, sharp and real. The plane was still there. Just sitting on the runway. Silent. Waiting. But the hum wasn't coming from inside the plane anymore. It was coming from everywhere. From the terminal. From the sky. From the goddamn air itself. Like whatever had taken Flight 742 wasn't just on the plane anymore. It was here. With us. Ortiz was shaking. We need to tell someone. She stammered. We need to. A radio crackled. Not from any of us. From the plane. The cockpit radio, still tuned to the emergency frequency. A burst of static, then, a voice. Not Captain Reynolds. Not the passengers. Something else. Something wrong. We never landed. The hum peaked. The tarmac shook. The plane, the whole damn plane, started to fade. Not like it was moving. Like it was vanishing. I grabbed Carson's arm. Do you see that? But Carson was staring at me in horror. I felt it then. The cold creeping up my spine. The strange, static weight settling over me. I looked down at my hands. And I realized. I was fading too. I was disappearing. I could feel it, like my body was slipping away, piece by piece, dissolving into the cold air. My fingers, my arms, my legs, turning weightless, transparent. I tried to move. Tried to speak. But my voice barely made a sound. Carson was yelling. Ortiz was screaming. But their voices sounded far away. Like I was already somewhere else. Like I was back on the plane. And then I was. The tarmac was gone. The hangar. Carson. Ortiz. All of it. Instead, I was standing in the aisle of Flight 742. Everything was wrong. The cabin lights flickered weakly. The seats were still filled with passengers. But they weren't moving. They weren't breathing. They were frozen, their faces twisted in expressions of shock, fear, confusion. Like they had been trapped in the last second before they vanished. The hum was louder than ever. And then, a slow, deliberate knocking from the cockpit door. I turned. The door swung open. And I finally saw them. The things that had taken Flight 742. They were tall. Too tall. Their limbs were long and wrong, their joints bending at impossible angles. Their skin wasn't skin. It was dark, shifting static, like they weren't completely real, like they were between places. And their eyes, if they even had eyes, were just voids. Empty. Hungry. Watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. They didn't speak, but somehow I heard them. Not with my ears. With my mind. You saw us. The plane shuddered. The hum became a roar. I felt my body being pulled away, dragged into something vast, something endless. Like I was falling into a space that shouldn't exist. A space where they lived. Where all the lost things go. I fought it. I don't know how, but I did. I closed my eyes. I focused on Carson's voice, Ortiz's screams, the hangar, the real world. I forced myself to remember where I was. And just like that, I was back. I collapsed onto the tarmac, gasping. The plane was gone. No fading. No hum. Just gone. Like it had never existed. Like none of it had ever happened. Except, I knew it had. Because Ortiz was still crying. Carson was still shouting my name. And my hands were still fading in and out. Like part of me hadn't made it back. Like part of me was still there. They shut the airport down that night. Called it a security issue. No official reports. No news coverage. Flight 742 was erased. No records. No manifests. No black box. It was like it had never existed at all. But I remember. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, when everything is still, I hear the hum. Growing louder. Closer. And I wonder, did I ever really come back? Or am I still there, on Flight 742, trapped in that empty, endless space? Waiting to be found again?